Caleb Morgan pressed his forehead against the neck of a dying horse and didn't say a word. He just breathed. Slow, ragged. The kind of breathing a man does when he's already lost too much to cry. 3 horses down in 4 days. The fever was spreading, and somewhere on the 2:15 train rolling toward Cedar Bluff, a woman he had never met. A woman he had written to out of desperation, not hope was coming to be his wife. He hadn't told her the ranch was dying. He hadn't told her anything at all. If this story already has your heart hit that subscribe button, drop the name of your city in the comments and let me know where in this beautiful country you're watching from. Now let's begin. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Eleanor Hayes. It arrived on a Tuesday, folded twice the edges, soft from handling, as though the man who wrote it had picked it up and put it back down more than once before finally sealing it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. The kind of handwriting a man produces when he's not used to writing much, but wants to get it right. My name is Caleb Morgan. I own a cattle ranch outside Cedar Bluff, Texas. I am 34 years old. I am not a man of many words, but I am an honest one. I am looking for a woman of sound character who is willing to build something real. I cannot promise comfort. I can promise I will work until my last breath to provide for whoever comes. That was the whole of it. No flattery, no promises of love, no description of himself beyond the facts. Eleanor had read it 4 times. She wasn't sure why she said yes. Maybe because the letter sounded like a man who needed rescuing more than she did. Maybe because the word honest sat in the middle of that short paragraph like a stone in still water. Simple, undeniable, impossible to move past. Maybe because she was 27 years old, and Cedar Bluff, Texas, was as far from Harlan County, Kentucky, as a woman could get on a train ticket she could actually afford. She folded the letter back along its original creases, tucked it into her coat pocket, and started packing. The train pulled into Cedar Bluff at 2:18 in the afternoon, 3 minutes behind schedule, and Eleanor stepped onto the platform with a single trunk, a leather satchel worn soft at the handles, and the particular stillness of a woman who had learned long ago to read a place before it read her. She stood at the edge of the platform and looked. Cedar Bluff was not much. A main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without argument. A general store. A livery. A church with a cracked bell tower. Heat pressing down on everything like a hand on a shoulder. Not friendly, not hostile, just insistent. The kind of summer heat that didn't announce itself. It just arrived and stayed and expected you to adjust. There were people watching her. A woman near the dry goods store who stopped sweeping to stare. 2 men at the hitching post who exchanged a look she was meant to see. A child who ran inside when Eleanor caught his eye as though she were something to report. She was used to being looked at. She was not, however, used to being looked at like she was already a problem. She picked up her trunk by the handle, settled the satchel across her shoulder, and waited. Caleb Morgan was supposed to meet her here. He had not arrived. She waited 10 minutes. 15. The platform emptied around her. The station master locked his window without making eye contact. The heat pressed harder. Eleanor set her trunk down, sat on top of it, and folded her hands in her lap, and watched the far end of the main street for a rider coming in from the hills. At the 30-minute mark she heard hoofbeats. He came in fast, too fast for a man coming to collect a woman he'd sent for. The horse was lathered. Caleb Morgan pulled up at the hitching post, dropped down before the animal had fully stopped, and crossed the platform in 6 strides. He was tall, broader through the chest and shoulders than she'd imagined. A face that had been weathered past its years, jaw set, hard eyes the color of creek water in August gray, with just enough brown in them to make you look twice. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept in days and had stopped noticing. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then he said, "Miss Hayes." "Mr. Morgan? You waited? You're late?" Something moved across his face, not quite shame, not quite surprise. He pulled his hat off, held it in both hands, and said, "I apologize for that. There was a situation at the ranch." "What kind of situation?" He paused. His jaw tightened. The kind I'd rather explain on the ride back. Eleanor studied him for exactly 3 seconds. "All right," she said. She picked up her satchel, and looked at the trunk. "Can your horse carry this?" "He can manage." "Then let's go, Renton." The ride to Morgan Ridge took 40 minutes, and Caleb Morgan said almost nothing for 39 of them. Eleanor didn't push. She had learned young that silence from a man wasn't rudeness, it was information. It told you where the walls were before you found them with your hands. So she watched the landscape instead, the way the hills rolled up and flattened out, the way the creek running beside the road had narrowed to something barely wider than a boot, the way the grass had gone from yellow to the particular pale color of things that had given up on water. It was the driest summer she'd seen in years. She noticed the creek level again. Something about it nagged at her. Not the dryness itself, which was obvious enough, but the color. The water wasn't just low, it was wrong. A faint milky cast to it, where it pooled near the rocks barely visible, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. She was always looking. "How long have the horses been sick?" she said. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. He didn't look at her. 4 days. "How many?" Another pause. Longer than the first. "Started with 2, now it's 6. "What are the signs?" "Fever. Won't eat. Stand wrong like their legs hurt them just to hold the weight. 2 of them been lying down. Can't get them back up." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She was thinking through what she knew, running her memory back through her mother's notebooks, through her grandmother's careful handwriting, through the years she'd spent learning which plants fixed what, and which water conditions caused which sicknesses in animals that drank where they shouldn't. "Have they been drinking from the creek?" she asked. Caleb turned his head to look at her for the first time since they'd started riding. "Everyone drinks from the creek." "I know. Have the horses been drinking from the part that runs through the lower field, where it slows down near the rocks?" He stared at her. "How did you know there's a lower field?" "I didn't. But there's almost always a lower field, and low water in summer tends to pool where the ground is lowest. Pooled water near rock and soil like this," she nodded toward the creek beside them, "can carry things that moving water flushes out, things that are hard on animals, especially in heat." He was still looking at her. She met his eyes. "I could be wrong," she said, "but I'd like to look at the creek before anything else." Caleb turned back to the road. His voice was quiet. "My foreman already sent for the doctor out of Abilene." "How long before he arrives?" 2 days, maybe 3. Eleanor said nothing. She looked at the creek again. 2 days was a long time for a horse that was already lying down. Morgan Ridge came into view as the road crested the last hill, and Eleanor understood immediately why the letter had been the way it was. The land was beautiful. Even under the drought, even in the flat white light of a Texas July afternoon, there was something about the way the hills rolled down to meet the valley, the way the fence lines ran straight and true across the property, the way the main house sat solid and well-built at the center of it all, that told you this had been someone's life's work. Every board, every post, every acre. She could also see the problem. 2 horses stood in the paddock nearest the barn. They stood wrong. Caleb had described it exactly right. The particular heaviness of an animal in pain, the way they shifted their weight like even standing, was an argument with their own bodies. One of them had its head low. Too low. A man was crossing from the barn to the paddock as they rode in. He stopped when he saw Eleanor. He was older than Caleb, somewhere past 50, stocky, with a face like old leather and eyes that didn't give anything away for free. He waited. "Miss Hayes," Caleb said as he helped her down from the horse. "This is my foreman, Hank Pruitt. He's been with the ranch 12 years. Hank nodded. Not unfriendly, but not warm. The nod of a man reserving judgment. "Mr. Pruitt," Eleanor said. "Ma'am?" He looked at Caleb. "Drummer went down about an hour ago. Can't get him up." Caleb went still. Eleanor didn't know which horse Drummer was, but she saw what that name did to Caleb Morgan's face, and she understood that it mattered beyond the economics of it. A man's face didn't do what his just did over an asset. "Show me," Caleb said. He walked toward the barn without looking back. Eleanor followed. Tut. Drummer was a chestnut gelding, maybe 16 hands, and he was on his side in the stall with his breathing coming hard and wrong. The sound of it hit Eleanor as soon as she stepped through the barn door, that labored, effortful breathing of a large animal in genuine distress, each breath a small fight. Caleb crouched beside the horse and put his hand on the animal's neck. He didn't speak. He just held his hand there, and the horse didn't move, and the stall was very quiet, except for that breathing. "How old?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low. 11, Caleb said. "He was my wife's." She let that sit. There was nothing to say to it that wouldn't be wrong. Instead, she moved to the other side of the stall, crouched down, and looked at the horse carefully. His gums were pale, not white, not yet, but pale enough, eyes dull. She pressed 2 fingers gently against the inside of his lip and felt the temperature there. She ran her hands along his belly, feeling for the hard tension of colic versus the loose depleted feel of something more systemic, not colic. She sat back on her heels and thought. Hank had come to the stall door and was watching her. His expression had shifted from reserved to something more careful, the look of a man who had expected to have an opinion and found himself uncertain. "You some kind of doctor?" he asked. "No," Eleanor said. "But my mother was the closest thing to 1 in 4 counties, and her mother before her." "What do you think's wrong with him?" Eleanor looked at Drummer. She looked at the water trough in the corner of the stall. She stood and walked to it, examined the residue at the water line, looked at the color of the water itself. Then she walked out of the stall and out the barn's side door to where the creek ran closest to the property, maybe 60 feet from the barn. Caleb followed her. She hadn't asked him to. She crouched at the water's edge and looked at it for a long time. The milky cast was stronger here. She picked up a handful of soil from the bank beside it and smelled it. There was a faint, sulphurous note to it barely there, the kind of thing that didn't announce itself. "There's iron and sulfur in this bank," she said. "It's been leaching into the water as the level drops. Moving water carries it through, but where it's pooling..." She pointed upstream to where a curve in the creek had created a still shadowed pocket. "It's concentrating. The horse is drinking from the trough nearest the barn. That trough feeds from where..." Caleb stared at her. Then he said slowly, "From the pump. The pump draws from the lower creek." "There it is," she said quietly. She stood. She brushed her hands on her skirt and looked at him. Caleb was staring at the creek. His jaw was working. She could see him doing the math. How many days, how many times they'd watered the animals from that trough, how long the water had been like this, and none of them had known to look. "Can you fix it?" he asked. His voice was flat, not hopeful. The voice of a man who had asked questions like this before and learned to keep his face blank while he waited for the answer. "Some of them, yes," she said. "If we move them off the creek water now and I can get the right plants together. Boneset. Black cohosh if it grows near here. Activated charcoal if you have it in the barn. It's sometimes used for colic. I need to flush their systems and give the sicker ones something to bring the inflammation down. And Drummer..." She held his gaze. She wasn't going to lie to him. "Drummer is the worst of them. I can't promise you Drummer." Something moved through Caleb Morgan's face. Then not collapse, not anger. Something quieter and older than either. The expression of a man who has already survived the worst thing that can happen to a person and is now learning that surviving it doesn't protect you from everything that comes after. "What do you need?" he said. "The creek mapped where it runs, where it pools. Help getting the sick horses off that water immediately and onto clean water from the well, not the pump. Time. And whoever knows this land best to take me along the creek bank before dark." Caleb looked at Hank. Something passed between them. "I know this land best," Caleb said. What happened next surprised her. She had expected reluctance. She had expected the particular stiff-shouldered resistance of a man who had sent for a wife and gotten something confusing. Instead, a woman who crouched at creek beds and talked about iron sulfate and used words like systemic in the context of horse illness. She had been prepared to work around that resistance quietly to do what needed doing without requiring him to acknowledge that she was the one doing it. Instead, Caleb Morgan put his hat back on, said, "Give me 10 minutes to set Hank to pulling the sick horses off the trough," and walked back to the barn without argument. She watched him go. Hank had stayed beside her. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "He's not a complicated man," Hank said finally. "He just does what needs doing." "I can see that," Eleanor said. "His wife was sick a long time before she passed." Hank paused. He seemed to be deciding how much to say. "He did everything any man could do. Didn't matter." Eleanor looked at him. "I know," she said. "That kind of thing leaves marks." Hank nodded slowly, as though she had given a correct answer to a question he hadn't quite asked out loud. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn. They walked the creek for 2 hours in the late afternoon heat. Caleb led her along the bank without speaking much, pointing. When she asked him to where the water came from, where it slowed, where the animals watered in dry years versus wet ones, he moved over the uneven ground with the ease of a man who had covered it 10,000 times, never looking at his feet, always slightly ahead of her, not from impatience, but from instinct. She found what she needed. Boneset growing in a damp hollow where the creek banked around a stand of cedar. Yarrow on the open hillside above it, dry but still viable. She had brought activated charcoal in her satchel, 2 small glass jars of it packed between her mother's notebook and a change of clothes, because she had learned to travel with it the way some women traveled with thread. She collected what she could carry, asking Caleb once to hold her satchel open while she filled it, which he did without being asked twice. She noticed he didn't ask her what the plants were for. He watched, but he didn't interrogate. She found that easier than she'd expected. On the walk back as the sun was dropping and the heat had eased by a single degree, barely enough to notice, but enough to breathe differently, he said without preamble, "I should have told you in the letter." She glanced at him. "Told me what?" "That the ranch was struggling, that things weren't right." He was looking at the ground ahead of them. "You deserved to know what you were coming to." Eleanor considered that. "Would you have told me if I'd asked more questions in my reply?" "I don't know," he said, which was honest. "Then we're even," she said. "I didn't ask." He looked at her sideways. There was something in his expression she didn't have a name for, yet surprised maybe, but quieter than surprise. The look of a man encountering something he wasn't sure he'd earned. "Why didn't you?" he asked. She kept walking. "Because the letter told me enough." "What did it tell you?" "That you were a man who showed up for things." She paused. "Even if you were late about it." He was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly she heard him exhale. Not a laugh exactly, but the sound a man makes when something small and unexpected lands right. She worked through the evening. Caleb had given her the use of the kitchen and a work table in the back room of the barn, and she had set up her preparations there. The charcoal dissolved in water, the boneset steeped down to a dark bitter liquid. The yarrow stripped and pulped for the compress she intended to try on the 2 horses with the worst fever. Hank helped her, wordlessly efficiently handing her what she needed holding horses, while she administered the doses, watching with the careful attention of a man who was learning something and knew it. He had the rare quality of being useful without requiring direction. The ranch's other 2 hands, a young man named Eddie, who couldn't be more than 20, and a quiet older Mexican cowboy named Ruiz, came to watch from the barn door. They didn't come in. They just watched. Eleanor paid them no mind. She had work to do. It was past 10 o'clock when she finally straightened her back and looked at the row of stalls. 3 of the 6 horses had accepted the treatment with minimal resistance. Their breathing was easier. 2 of the others had taken it harder. Still feverish, still reluctant to drink even the clean well water. But they were upright, which was something. Drummer was still down. She had administered his dose in 3 careful stages, sitting with him in the stall for an hour while Hank held a lantern. His breathing had steadied slightly. The utter wrong sound of it had eased to something labor than crisis. But he hadn't risen. He hadn't tried. Eleanor sat with her back against the stall wall and let herself be tired for a minute. Caleb appeared at the stall door. He had a tin cup of coffee, and he held it out to her without speaking. She took it. "Thank you." He crouched down on the other side of Drummer, the way he had earlier, his hand resting on the horse's neck. The lantern light caught the lines of his face, and she could see how much he was holding. "He's breathing better," she said. "That's real." "Yeah." His voice was rough. "I need to stay with him a few more hours. Make sure he doesn't go backward." Caleb nodded. He didn't say she didn't have to. He didn't say it was unnecessary. He understood that she meant what she said. "I'll stay," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the horse. "You don't have to." "I know I don't." He settled back against the stall wall across from her, his long legs stretched out, hat pushed back. "I know." So they stayed. The barn was quiet around them in the way barns are at night. The small sounds of animals breathing the shift of weight in straw, the occasional distant creak of the structure settling in the cooling air. Outside, somewhere across the valley, a coyote called once and went silent. At some point, Caleb said without looking at her, "Where'd you learn all this, the plants, the water?" "My mother," Eleanor said. "Her mother before her. My grandmother grew up on land that didn't have a doctor within 2 days' ride. You learn, or people don't get help." "Your mother's still living." "No." She said it simply without weight on it, the way you say a thing when you've had time to carry it properly. 3 years ago. "I'm sorry." "I'm sorry for your wife," she said. A long silence. Drummer's breathing moved through it steady and slow. "Her name was Catherine," Caleb said. He said it like a man who didn't say it often, who had to find where the word lived before he could get it out. "She was sick 2 winters. She knew the horses better than I did, every one of them by name and habit." His hand moved slightly on Drummer's neck. He was hers the way some horses just belong to one person. Eleanor didn't say anything. She held her coffee cup with both hands and let him talk, because a man who hasn't talked about a thing in a long time needs the silence to be friendly while he does it. "I didn't handle it right," Caleb said. "After. He stopped. "I worked. That's all I did. Worked and kept the thing running, and didn't look up for about 1.5 years. "That's handling it," Eleanor said quietly. "Not the same as handling it well, but it kept you here." He looked at her then. In the lantern light, his face was something she couldn't quite read yet, too many layers too recently opened. "Why did you say yes?" he asked. "To the letter. You didn't know anything about me." "You said you were honest," she said. "That's not enough." "It's more than most men put in a letter like that." She met his eyes. "And I needed somewhere to go that was different enough to matter. Cedar Bluff, Texas is different enough." The ghost of something, almost a smile, but not quite, moved across his face. "That's a fact," he said. Drummer shifted, just slightly. A small movement of his head, a reorientation of his neck on the straw. Both of them went still and watched. The horse didn't rise, but he moved. He was still in there, still present, still deciding. "Come on," Caleb said under his breath. Not to Eleanor, to the horse. "Come on, old boy, don't you dare." Eleanor looked at the man across the lantern light and thought he sent a letter asking for a wife, and God sent him something harder and more useful, and he doesn't know yet what to do with that. But he's not running from it. That, she thought, was enough. For tonight, that was enough. She refilled her cup from the small pot Hank had left on the barrel inside the barn door, settled back against the stall wall, and kept watch. Outside, the Texas night pressed down warm and close on Morgan Ridge, and the stars over the hill country burned the way they do in summer. Too bright, too many. Like the sky was trying to make up for what the ground had lost. Inside the barn, a horse breathed, and a man and a woman, who did not yet know each other, held the line between losing and not losing side by side in the straw, and that was how the first night began. Drummer was on his feet by morning, not strong, not right, but standing, which was more than Eleanor had let herself hope for when the clock in her head had ticked past 2 in the morning, and the horse still hadn't moved. She had stayed until nearly 4, administering the third and final dose in the dark, while Caleb held the lantern without being asked, before she'd finally gone inside to sleep for 3 hours, on the narrow bed in the room he'd shown her, a clean room, spare but clean, which told her something about him. She filed away without comment. When she came back to the barn at first light, Drummer was standing. Caleb was already there. He was sitting on an overturned bucket outside the stall, elbows on his knees, hat in his hands, looking at the horse the way a man looks at something he wasn't sure he'd get to see again. He didn't hear her come in. Or if he did, he didn't move. Eleanor stopped a few feet away and looked at the horse herself. Drummer's head was still low. His coat was rough, not yet recovered. But his eyes were open and aware, and he was bearing his own weight on all 4 legs, and that was the thing that mattered. She said, "Good morning." Caleb looked up. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, because the crisis wasn't over, but the particular easing of a man who has been holding his breath for hours and finally allowed himself one full exhale. "He got up about an hour ago," Caleb said. "Just stood up, like he decided." "They do that," Eleanor said. "When they're going to make it, they decide. You can't rush it." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he stood, put his hat on, and said, "There's coffee inside. Ruiz made biscuits. I'll get them after I check the others." He nodded and fell in beside her as she moved down the row of stalls, not leading, not following, just present, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through a space. The other 5 horses had all made it through the night upright. 2 of them were showing genuine improvement, clear eyes interest in the clean well water she'd had Hank switch them to the previous evening. 1 was still feverish, but eating, which was progress. She said, "The one's still running warm. I want to give them another round of the bone-set mixture this morning, and the water situation needs a more permanent fix. The trough that draws from the lower pump needs to be disconnected until the creek comes back up. Is there enough capacity in the well to water all of them?" "We'll make it work," Caleb said. "I also want to walk the upper creek today. There may be a cleaner source above the contamination point. If the water level is this low through July, you'll need a better draw point before fall." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him processing, sorting through the practical math of it. Then he said, "Hank can take you up there after breakfast. I've got fence line to deal with on the east quarter." She glanced at him. "You don't have to send Hank with me. I can read a creek." "I know you can," he said, not dismissively, just as fact. "But you don't know the property yet, and the hill country up there has drop-offs that don't announce themselves." He paused. "Humor me." She almost smiled. "All right." The biscuits were good. Ruiz made them the way someone who'd been cooking for a working ranch for years made them, nothing fancy, nothing wasted, just solid and right. Eleanor ate at the kitchen table across from Eddie, who was 21 years old, and she had already concluded, deeply uncertain, what to make of her. He sat across from her and ate half a biscuit in one bite and said with the blunt directness of a young man who hadn't learned yet to work up to things, "So you're a healer?" "No," Eleanor said. "I know some things about plants and water and animal sickness. That's different from being a healer." Caleb send for a healer in the letter, or a wife? A wife. Eddie chewed, considered this. "But you're doing healer things." "I'm doing what's needed," she said. "Same as anyone would." He looked at her with an expression that was too old for his face. The look of a young man who had seen enough hard seasons on a working ranch to know that same as anyone would was not in fact what most people did. "The last woman Caleb hired to cook and keep house lasted 3 weeks, Eddie said. "Not a wife, just a woman from town. She said it was too quiet." Eleanor picked up her coffee cup. "I don't mind quiet. Even after last night." She looked at him. He wasn't being unkind. He was genuinely asking in the way of someone taking inventory. "Last night wasn't quiet," she said. And I didn't mind that either. Eddie nodded slowly like a man marking something down in a ledger. Then he took another enormous bite of biscuit and said around it, "Drummer's looking better." "He is. That horse has been on this ranch since before I got here. Never talks about him, but he checks on him first thing every morning, has for years." He paused. "Never told you that." "We haven't had much time for conversation." "No?" Eddie said. "I reckon you haven't." Hank was a different kind of company than Caleb. More words, but placed more carefully, like a man who had learned that unnecessary speech cost you something. He walked Eleanor up the east bank of the creek that morning with a long walking stick he used to check the depth at intervals, pointing out the landmarks she'd need to orient herself. The cedar break that marked the upper property line. The limestone shelf where the water ran clear even in drought years because it came from a spring rather than surface runoff. The spring was there. It was lower than it should have been, but it was clean. Eleanor tasted it, a thing that made Hank raise both eyebrows but not speak, and confirmed it. No sulfur, no iron bite, cold, which meant it ran deep. "That's your source," she told him. "For the horses and the household both until the main creek recovers. Can you run a line from here to the barn?" Hank looked at the distance, looked at the terrain, worked through it the way experienced men work through logistics, quietly without drama. "It's doable," he said. "Weeks' worth of work, maybe less if Caleb and Eddie pitch in. We'd need pipe from town." "How far is town?" 40 minutes. "Then that's today's errand," she said, "before we lose more time." Hank looked at her with that measuring expression she was getting used to. "You always move this fast." "When it's needed," she said. "Caleb moves fast too," he said. "Different way. He moves fast on the physical things, the fence line, the hauling, the building. He's slower on—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider how much he was saying. "On the other things," Eleanor finished quietly. "Yeah." Hank tapped the ground with his walking stick. "He's a good man. Best man I've worked for in 30 years of ranching, and I've worked for some good ones, but he's been—" Another pause. "Running on empties, the way I'd put it, for a while now." Eleanor looked at the spring water moving over the limestone. He held this place together on his own. After his wife, through the drought. That takes a toll. "It does." Hank looked at her sideways. "You seem to understand that already." "I've seen it before," she said simply. "In people and in land both. Holding on is different from being all right." Hank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Hayes, I want to say something, and I want you to take it the right way." "Go ahead." "Last night, when you came off that train and I saw you, I thought to myself that Caleb had sent for the wrong kind of woman, someone soft, someone who'd be gone inside a month." He paused. "I was wrong about that." Eleanor considered several responses. She settled on, "I appreciate you saying so. I don't say things I don't mean. I could tell that about you early on," she said. They walked back down the creek bank together, and Hank said he'd tell Caleb about the pipe that evening, and Eleanor said she needed to stop at the general store in town, if they were making a trip, because she was nearly out of 2 things she'd need for the horses' continued treatment, and Hank said he'd add it to the list. It was an ordinary conversation, the kind that happens between people who have decided without saying so to be on the same side of a problem. It was in town that the first trouble found her. She hadn't expected trouble in Cedar Bluff. She had expected indifference, perhaps, or the mild suspicion that small towns develop toward outsiders the way creeks developed silt, gradually, without intention, just as a matter of accumulation. She had not expected the woman outside the general store. Her name, Eleanor would learn later, was Mrs. Aldine Marsh. She was somewhere past 60, with the upright carriage of a woman who had decided decades ago that bearing was a substitute for warmth, and she was standing near the store's entrance when Eleanor came up the steps with Hank behind her. Mrs. Marsh looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who has decided something before she's had all the facts and is committed to it now. "You're the woman Caleb Morgan sent for," she said. "Not a question." "I am," Eleanor said. "You were in his barn last night, all night." Eleanor met her eyes. I was treating his horses. There was an illness in the livestock. Mrs. Marsh's eyes moved over Eleanor in a way that catalogued and found wanting simultaneously. And you'd know about livestock illness? I would, yes. You're not a doctor. No, ma'am. Then by what authority? By the authority of knowing what I know, Eleanor said, keeping her voice pleasant, and by the fact that Mr. Morgan asked for my help, which is generally all the authority a person needs to do a useful thing. Mrs. Marsh's chin came up. Behind Eleanor she heard Hank make a very small sound, not quite a cough, not quite a laugh. I've known Caleb Morgan for 15 years, Mrs. Marsh said. I knew his wife. Catherine was a good woman, a proper woman, the kind of woman who belonged on that land. I'm sure she was, Eleanor said. And I'm sorry for the loss of her. Caleb clearly was too. He needs... Mrs. Marsh stopped herself, reconfigured. This town takes care of its own, Miss Hayes. There are women here who could have been a suitable match for Caleb without him sending away to another assessment of Eleanor's person, Kentucky, or wherever it is you come from. I come from Harlan County, Eleanor said. And I imagine those women are fine women. But Caleb wrote the letter he wrote, and I answered it, and here I am. I don't intend to be a problem for anyone in this town, Mrs. Marsh. I just intend to do right by the man I came to. She held the woman's gaze for exactly long enough to make her point without making an enemy, then stepped around her and into the store. Behind her, she heard Hank say pleasantly, "Morning, Aldine," with the faint emphasis of a man who had found the encounter entertaining and was not hiding it particularly well. Inside the store, things went differently. The proprietor, a man named Gideon Price, who had the slightly startled look of someone who'd overheard the conversation outside and wasn't sure which side to be on, helped her locate what she needed with minimal fuss. She was at the counter when the store's back door opened, and a man came in from the stockroom with a crate of supplies. He stopped when he saw her. He was about Caleb's age, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of easy-assembled confidence of a man accustomed to being looked at favorably. He set the crate down and smiled at her, and it was a good smile, the practiced kind. "You must be Morgan's bride," he said. "I must be," Eleanor said without the smile. He offered his hand. "Weston Clay. I run the double C spread about 3 miles south of Morgan Ridge." She shook his hand. Brief. "Eleanor Hayes." Hayes. He repeated it like he was tasting it. "You come a long way, Miss Hayes." "I did." "Morgan treating you all right out there?" "He is." Weston Clay leaned against the counter with the ease of a man in a room he owns without owning it. "Heard there's some sickness in his livestock. Bad business. Happens to everyone out here at some point drought like this." He paused. "If Morgan needs any help labor resources, I'd be glad to offer, neighbor to neighbor." Eleanor looked at him. There was nothing overtly wrong in anything he said. He was friendly, helpful, and looking at her just a degree too carefully for it to be entirely neighborly. "That's a kind offer," she said. "I'll tell him you said so." "You do that." He picked up the crate. "And Miss Hayes, if you find yourself out here and find the situation isn't quite what you expected, Cedar Bluff is a small town. Plenty of people willing to help a woman in a difficult circumstance." She met his eyes. "I'll keep that in mind." He smiled again, picked up his crate, and went back through the door. Eleanor turned back to the counter where Gideon Price was looking at her with an expression of concentrated neutrality. "He's a frequent visitor," she said flatly. "Yes, ma'am," Gideon said carefully. "And Morgan Ridge and Double C have had no difficulties with each other." A very precise pause. "Not recently, ma'am." Eleanor paid for her supplies and went outside. Chapter 10. She told Caleb that evening. Not about Mrs. Marsh that was small-town weather predictable and not worth the time. But about Weston Clay, she told him directly, because she had already decided that the thing about Caleb Morgan she intended to hold on to was the honesty in that first letter, and it worked both directions. They were at the kitchen table after supper. Hank gone home to his cabin on the south side of the property, Eddie and Ruiz finished, and outside. Caleb had poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her, while she updated her notes in her mother's notebook editions in her own handwriting observations about the horses, the water, the land. Weston Clay was in town today, she said without looking up. Caleb went still, the kind of stillness that was its own kind of answer. He introduced himself, Eleanor said. Help, was very present. Caleb set his coffee cup down, slow, deliberate. What did he say? That if I found the situation out here wasn't what I expected, there were people in town willing to help a woman in a difficult circumstance. A long silence. He said that, Caleb said. His voice was very quiet and very even, the way voices get when someone is holding something carefully. He did. She looked up at him now. I want to know what I'm in the middle of, Caleb. Not half of it. All of it. He looked at his coffee cup. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he said, Clay's been interested in this land for 3 years, since before Catherine died. He made an offer when I was in the worst of it after she passed, and I turned him down. He's made 2 more offers since. The last one was February. The price goes up every time. He wants Morgan Ridge. He wants the water access, Caleb said. The creek runs through this property before it reaches his. He controls the downstream end, but the source rights are mine. In a drought year, he stopped. In a drought year, those rights are worth more than the land itself. Eleanor sat very still. And the sickness in the horses, the contamination in the water. Caleb looked at her. Neither of them said it, but it sat between them, solid and specific, the possibility they were both looking at. How long has the lower trough been drawing from the contaminated section? She asked. 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 7. And the creek level started dropping when? End of May. She was quiet. She was thinking about the soil at the bank, the concentrated mineral content, the pooling in the curve just below where the trough pump drew from. The particular location of it right at the point where someone who knew the water system of Morgan Ridge would know the draw point was. She was thinking about how a man with resources and motive might understand that a drought year contamination event in the livestock water, if it went undetected long enough, could break a smaller operation before the season ended. I could be wrong, she said. You could be, Caleb said. He didn't sound like he thought she was. Have you had anyone on the property you don't recognize in the last 2 months? Anyone near the creek on the lower field? He was quiet for too long. 3 weeks ago, he said slowly, I found a gate open on the south fence, the one that backs up to Clay's property line. I thought it was Eddie leaving it. I didn't. He stopped. I didn't think about it more than that. The silence in the kitchen was a different quality than the silence in the barn. Harder, more specific. I want to be clear about something, Eleanor said. I don't know what happened. I know the water was contaminated and the horses got sick, and that's what I can prove. Everything else is what it is, Caleb said. Yes. He stood, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her. Outside, the evening was doing what evenings did on the high ground, the light going flat and blue, the heat beginning its slow, reluctant retreat. I've been fighting this place alone for 2 years, he said. Fence by fence, payment by payment. Kept telling myself if I could just get through the next hard thing, the next season, the next... He stopped. He put both hands on the window frame. I almost sold in February. You should know that. I sat with his offer for 2 weeks. I was close. What stopped you? He didn't answer immediately. Then, Catherine's buried on this land. It landed the way the truth lands quietly, without extra weight, because it didn't need it. Eleanor looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at the particular posture of a man who has been holding something very heavy for so long that he's stopped noticing it isn't his own body anymore. You're not alone in it now, she said. He turned around. She held his gaze. I came here to build something. Those were your words in the letter, and I agreed to them. I don't agree to half of something, Caleb. If someone is working against this ranch, that's working against me too, and I don't sit still for that. Something moved through his face, a fractional change, difficult to name, the kind of shift that happens in a person when a door they'd stopped expecting to open actually does. You've been here 1 day, he said. I know. You don't owe this place anything yet. I know that too. She held his eyes. But I'm here, and Drummer's standing, and you've got a clean water source at the spring above the cedar break that Hank says you can pipe to the barn in a week. Those are facts you didn't have yesterday. He was quiet for a long moment. That's true, he said finally. Then let's deal with what's true, she said, and figure out the rest one step at a time. She did not sleep well that night. It wasn't the bed which was adequate, or the heat which she had begun to make her peace with. It was the thing she hadn't said to Caleb, the part of her thinking she'd kept behind her teeth, because it wasn't solid enough to speak yet. The contamination she'd found was real. The mineral leaching was real. Drought conditions absolutely produced it naturally. She had seen it before in Kentucky in a summer that had killed 2 of her neighbors' cows before anyone understood the water had gone bad. But the location of it nagged at her. The way it was concentrated exactly at the draw point of the trough that fed the barn. The way it would have been almost impossible to detect without knowing to look for it, and she'd only known to look because she'd been watching the creek from the saddle and noticed the color. She lay in the dark and thought about it, and eventually stopped thinking about it because thinking past the facts you had was a way of building a story that felt true and wasn't necessarily. What she knew was this: the horses were recovering. The water source was being fixed. Caleb Morgan was aware of the threat to his land, and he was not a man who would sit still once he was aware of something. And Weston Clay, whoever he was and whatever he'd done or hadn't done, would find that the woman Caleb Morgan had sent for was not the kind of woman who looked at a dying thing and walked away from it. She fell asleep on that thought, and it held her steady through till morning. The second day began harder. Drummer, who had stood through the night, was down again by 6 in the morning. Eleanor came into the barn and found Caleb already there, crouched in the stall, and this time his face was a different thing than the previous morning. Not the exhausted relief of a man who'd made it through, but the tight-braced expression of someone watching a door close again that he'd barely gotten open. He went down about an hour ago, Caleb said. He didn't look at her. His breathing changed. He's warmer again. Eleanor crouched beside the horse. The fever had spiked. She could feel it without a thermometer. The heat off his coat, the rapid, shallow quality of his breath, the way his body was working too hard for what should have been a resting state. She went to her satchel and came back with the last of the black cohosh preparation she'd made the night before, which she hadn't anticipated needing again so soon. Hank appeared at the stall door. He looked at Drummer, then at Eleanor. He didn't say anything. She administered the dose carefully, talking to the horse the way her grandmother had taught her, low, continuous, not because horses understood words, but because the tone carried information their bodies registered. She felt the animal's tension slowly under her hands, fractionally, the way tension leaves things when they are very tired of holding it. "You're going to have to make a decision about the doctor," she said, not looking up. "When he arrives from Abilene. If Drummer's fever doesn't break today, it may be beyond what I can manage with what I have." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not saying I'm giving up on him. I'm not. But you should know the line. I appreciate you telling me straight." She sat back and looked at the horse. "He's fighting," she said. "You can see it. He's not gone." Caleb said very quietly, "No, he's not." She looked at Caleb's face and saw something she hadn't expected. Not just grief, but the particular exhaustion of a man who had been in this exact position before, watching something he loved fight to stay, and knowing that watching wasn't enough, and wasn't nothing, and was all he had. She understood then, with the particular clarity that comes from paying attention, rather than asking, that every moment Caleb spent in this stall was also every moment he'd spent in whatever room Catherine had been in at the end. That the horse and the woman had become tangled in his memory in a way that wasn't rational and didn't need to be. That every time Drummer got back up, something in Caleb that had nothing to do with horses got back up with him. She did not say any of that. She said, "Go eat something. I'll stay with him." "Eleanor, go." She met his eyes. "I have him. I'll come for you if anything changes." He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light caught the exhaustion in his face, the 3 days of it stacked on top of everything that had come before. Then he stood slowly and put his hat on and walked out of the barn. Eleanor turned back to the horse. "Come on," she said the same way she'd heard Caleb say it the night before, with the same quiet ferocity that doesn't beg, just insists. "You're Catherine's horse. She picked you. That means you've got some standard to live up to, and lying down doesn't meet it." Drummer's ear twitched. It wasn't much, but it was something. She settled into the straw beside him, her hand on his neck, and held the line. By noon, the fever broke. Not fully. Not the clean, definitive break that meant safety, but enough. Enough that when Eleanor stood up and stretched her back and looked at the horse, she could see the quality of his stillness had changed from the heaviness of illness to the heaviness of exhausted sleep. She went to the kitchen doorway and said to the room at large, to wherever Caleb was, "The fever's down." He appeared from the direction of the back room with the look of a man who hadn't gone far. She said, "He's not out of it yet, but he's better than this morning." Caleb nodded, just once, but his shoulders dropped half an inch, which was, she was learning, the equivalent of another man collapsing with relief. "We need to talk about the fence on the south field," she said, "and I want you to tell me where that gate is." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if something's wrong on this property, I'd rather know where the entry points are," she said. "And because you're not dealing with this by yourself anymore, and I need to know the land the same way you do." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "Finish your coffee. I'll saddle the horses." She picked up her cup. Outside, somewhere past the barn and across the dry grass of Morgan Ridge, the morning was becoming afternoon, and the Texas hill country stretched out in all directions, under a sky that had no intention of offering any apology for what it had put this place through. And somewhere south of the property line, Weston Clay's double C spread sat in the heat, and that gate sat in the south fence, and a question that didn't have an answer yet was waiting to become one. The south fence gate was exactly where Caleb said it would be. They rode out together after noon, the heat sitting on the land like something with weight and intention, and Caleb took her along the property line at a pace that was neither rushed nor leisurely, the pace of a man who had covered this ground so many times that his body did it without consulting his mind. Eleanor rode beside him and watched the land the way she'd learned to watch things, not looking for anything specific, just letting it show her what was there. The gate was a standard ranch gate, iron-framed, hinged on a cedar post that had been set well and hadn't moved. It opened onto a narrow track that ran south through scrub brush toward the Double C property line, maybe a quarter-mile away. The latch was the kind that required 2 hands to operate, not complicated, but deliberate. Not something a wind pushed open. Caleb dismounted and crouched to look at the ground around the post. Eleanor stayed on her horse and watched him work through it, the way his eyes moved, the way he touched the ground with 2 fingers, the way he stood slowly and looked toward the Double C without saying anything for a long moment. "Boot prints," he said finally. "More than one set, and they're not Eddie's. Eddie's got a narrow heel, wears the same boots he's had for 3 years. These are wider." He paused. "Recent. Week, maybe 10 days. How far does that track go before it hits Clay's line?" "Quarter mile. Maybe a bit less." He looked at the gate itself. The latch. No damage. Someone who knew how to work it, or someone who'd worked it before. Eleanor looked south down the track. "Can you prove any of it?" "No," he said flatly. "Then we don't say anything yet." He turned to look at her. There was a question in his face. "If you go to town and say Weston Clay poisoned your water with no proof, and a sick horse as your only evidence, what happens?" she said. He was quiet. "He's got more money than you," she said. "He's been here longer than you've been running this place alone, and the first thing he'll say is that drought conditions cause mineral contamination in low water, which is true, and everyone will nod because it's true." She held his gaze. "You need something that can't be argued past. We don't have that yet." Caleb looked at the gate for a long moment. His jaw was working the way it did when he was holding something in that wanted to come out differently. "He's been picking at this ranch for 3 years," he said. "Offers, suggestions, showing up when I was down. Every time something went wrong there, he was helpful, friendly, just happening to have a better offer ready. His voice was very controlled. I kept thinking I was imagining it. You weren't imagining it, Eleanor said. But imagining it and proving it are different things. He looked at her. You're calm about this. I'm not calm, she said. I'm focused. There's a difference. Something moved in his face. All right, he said. What do? We fix the water pipe to the spring. We get the horses healthy. We make sure this ranch is standing on solid ground before we pick a fight we can't afford to lose. She paused. And we keep that gate under observation without him knowing we are. Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at the gate one more time, then back at her. You think like a rancher, he said. I think like someone who grew up watching people fight over resources they couldn't afford to lose, she said. Kentucky's got its own version of Weston Clay. Different accent, same math. He almost smiled, not quite, but close enough that she saw it before he turned away. 3 days passed. Drummer got stronger. It happened the way recovery happened in animals, not in a straight line, but in a wavering forward progress that looked like setbacks, until you stepped back and measured from where you'd started. By the 4th morning, he was eating. Not much, not with appetite, but eating. By the 5th morning, he was standing at the stall door when Eleanor came in, which was his way of telling her that the stall was boring and he was done with convalescence. She told Caleb at breakfast. He put his coffee cup down and said nothing for a full 10 seconds, which was his version of breaking down with relief. The other horses had largely recovered. The 2 that had been least affected were back on full rotation with the ranch work. The pipeline from the spring was half finished. Caleb and Eddie had been on it every day, and Hank had ridden to town twice for additional pipe fittings. The household was using well water exclusively. The contaminated trough had been drained and scrubbed and left dry. Slowly, quietly, Morgan Ridge had begun to stabilize, and that was when the neighbors started arriving. It began with a woman named Harriet Beale, who showed up on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 of her own horses, showing the early signs of the same fever, the low head, the reluctant, eating the slight wrongness in how they bore their weight. She'd heard from someone in town, she didn't say who, that the Morgan Ranch woman had dealt with something similar. Eleanor went out and looked at the horses and asked 3 questions and confirmed what she suspected. The Beale property ran along the same creek system 2 miles upstream. If the contamination had a source above the natural sulfur deposit, Eleanor had identified it was spreading. She spent 2 hours with Harriet Beale's horses. She left her with enough of the bone set preparation for 3 days and clear instructions about switching water sources, and she told Caleb that evening that they had a larger problem than one ranch. If the contamination is upstream from us, she said, there could be 3, 4, 5 other properties affected. The Beales are showing it now. Others will be showing it soon. Caleb leaned forward in his chair. How far up does the creek run? I don't know this land well enough yet, but Hank will. She paused. I need to know who's on the creek above Beale's property. Caleb went still. She watched his face. Clay's upper pasture, he said, runs along the creek about a mile above Beale. She held his gaze. And if Clay's upper pasture has been used recently, if someone drove livestock through it, or if there's been disturbance of the bank near the source, then the contamination didn't start with natural drought conditions, Caleb said. His voice had gone very quiet. Then it might not have started naturally at all, she said. The kitchen was very still. Can you prove that? He asked. Not from here, she said. I need to walk the creek above Beale's property. I need to see what the bank looks like up there. That's Clay's land. I know. You can't go on Clay's land without... I know, she said again. I'm not saying I go now. I'm saying we need a way to look at that bank. She paused. Does Beale's property share a fence line with Clay's upper pasture? Caleb thought about it. Eastern edge, maybe. Then Harriet Beale has standing to walk her own fence line, and if she happens to look at the creek while she does it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You want to ask Harriet Beale to look at Clay's creek bank for you. I want to ask Harriet Beale to walk her fence line and notice what she notices, Eleanor said. What she decides to report about it is her own business. A long pause. Then Caleb said slowly, "You're something, Miss Hayes." "I'm practical," she said, "which is what this situation requires." It was Harriet Beale's report delivered later that changed everything. She came to Morgan Ridge in the morning, came to the kitchen door, and asked for Eleanor specifically. She was a solid, weathered woman in her late 40s, who had the look of someone who'd worked her land without help for a long time and had stopped wasting effort on things that didn't matter. She sat at the kitchen table and folded her hands and said without preamble, "There's a depression in the creek bank on the Clay property side. About 3 feet deep, maybe 4 feet across. Recent. The soil's disturbed, you can see it's not weathering, it's turned. And there's a pipe. Buried shallow, coming from the direction of the Clay outbuildings. The end of it is cracked or broken. I couldn't get close enough to tell which. But whatever ran through it, it ran toward the creek." The kitchen went silent. Eleanor looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Harriet Beale. "You saw this clearly," Caleb said. "I walked that fence line twice," Harriet said. "I'm not imagining things, Caleb. My horses are sick and I'm not imagining things." "What kind of pipe?" Eleanor asked. "Old iron. The kind for drainage or chemical runoff from outbuildings." Harriet paused. "My husband used to run a pipe like that from the equipment barn, for the mineral salts and lime runoff after rainy season." Eleanor knew immediately what that meant. Iron pipe mineral runoff at concentrated volume, directed into a low-moving creek in drought conditions. It wouldn't kill the creek outright. It would just contaminate it. Gradually. Specifically. In exactly the way she'd found at Morgan Ridge's draw point. "This is evidence," she said. "It's what I saw," Harriet said. "I can't tell you what it means." "It means," Caleb said, and his voice had a quality in it Eleanor hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly, but the hardened clarity of a man who has had a suspicion confirmed and is now moving past it into decision. That Clay's been running chemical waste into the creek deliberately, in drought, when he knew what it would do downstream. Harriet looked at him steadily. "If that's what it is." "You'd be willing to say what you saw?" Eleanor asked. "To who?" "To a land commissioner. Or a federal marshal if it comes to that." Eleanor held the woman's gaze. "Water rights violations in drought conditions are federal jurisdiction in this territory, Mrs. Beale. Deliberate contamination of a shared water source with intent to damage downstream property, that's not a local matter. That goes above whatever Clay has in terms of influence in Cedar Bluff." Harriet was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she said, "He bought the water rights to the Henderson property last year, the one on the east side of town. People thought it was just land speculation." "It wasn't just land speculation," Caleb said. "No," Harriet said. "I don't think it was." She looked up. "If I say what I saw, Caleb, if this goes where you're saying it goes, Clay won't let that sit." "I know," Caleb said. "He's got friends in this county." "I know. You ready for what comes after?" Caleb looked at Eleanor across the table. She met his gaze and gave him nothing but steadiness, not a promise she wasn't in a position to make, not false confidence, just the particular steadiness of a person who has decided to stand still in a hard place. He turned back to Harriet. "Yeah," he said. "I am." What came after arrived faster than any of them expected. Weston Clay came to Morgan Ridge himself the following afternoon. He rode in without announcement, which was either confidence or arrogance. Eleanor wasn't sure of the distinction in a man like him. He rode a good horse dressed well for a ranch visit and had the same easy assembled manner she'd seen in the general store, the kind that sat on a man like a jacket he'd learned to wear so long he forgot it was there. Caleb met him in the yard. Eleanor watched from the porch. She wasn't trying to hide. She was simply not moving toward him, which was its own kind of statement. "Caleb," Clay said, and swung down with the ease of a man treating someone else's property like a place he was comfortable. Heard you had some trouble with the livestock. Heard that, did you? Caleb said. He didn't move from where he was standing. He didn't tip his hat. Clay glanced toward the porch, saw Eleanor, and produced that smile. Miss Hayes, good to see you settling in. Eleanor nodded, said nothing. Clay turned back to Caleb. I want to talk to you man to man, Caleb. Neighbor to neighbor. Then talk. A slight pause. The smile stayed, but it moved from friendly to something more careful. There are some things being said in town, about the creek, about the livestock sickness. He kept his voice easy. I want you to know I have nothing but goodwill toward Morgan Ridge. Whatever caused the problem with your water drought, natural contamination, whatever it turns out to be, I'd like to offer resources to help, equipment, labor, and I want to renew my offer on the property, Caleb, better than the one in February. Caleb said no. One word. Flat. Final. Clay's expression shifted. Fractionally. The offer's a good one, given the condition of the ranch right now. The condition of this ranch, Caleb said, is getting better every day. My horses are recovering. My water source is fixed. And I've got a partner in this property who knows what she's doing. He looked at Clay with the particular calm of a man who has gotten past his own fear and arrived somewhere beyond it. I won't be selling Weston. Not now, not in February, not ever. Clay looked at Eleanor. Something in his gaze sharpened. She's been filling your head with, she's been saving my livestock and fixing my water supply, Caleb said, while someone was working to destroy both. I'd watch how you finish that sentence. The air between them changed. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud, the particular density of two men who have arrived at the place where pleasantries are over. Clay said quietly, You want to be careful about the claims you make, Caleb. I'm not making claims, Caleb said. I'm telling you the ranch isn't for sale. Anything else you want to discuss? You discuss it with my lawyer or with the land commissioner's office in Abilene. A long pause. Clay put his hat back on. He looked at Eleanor one more time, a look that she held without flinching, without warmth, and then he turned his horse and rode south. The yard was quiet. Eddie had appeared at the barn door without anyone noticing. Hank was standing at the corner of the barn, arms folded with the expression of a man who had just watched something he'd been waiting to see. Eleanor came down off the porch. She walked to where Caleb was standing, still looking south after Clay. That'll make things harder, she said. Yeah, he said. He knows we know something. Yeah. He'll move faster now, whatever he was planning. Probably. He turns to look at her. You scared? She considered the question. No, she said. I'm paying attention, which is better. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd seen fragments of over the past days, but not in full, something direct and unguarded, and not quite comfortable with itself, the look of a man who keeps finding things where he didn't put them. Eleanor, he said. Yes. I'm glad you answered that letter. She held his gaze. So am I, she said, and meant it entirely. The letter from the land commissioner's office arrived 6 days later. Eleanor had written it herself at the kitchen table, 3 nights after Clay's visit, while Caleb was doing the evening rounds. She had drafted it twice, the first time, too emotional, the second time right. Factual, specific naming. What Harriet Beale had seen naming the dates, and the creek levels, and the mineral analysis she had done herself with the testing she'd learned from her mother's notebooks. She had written it as a statement of observed facts, not a complaint, not an accusation, and she had had Harriet Beale sign it alongside her own name. She had put it in the mail the morning after it was written, before she mentioned it to Caleb. When she did tell him over breakfast, he looked at her across the table with an expression that was equal parts surprised and something she didn't have a word for. You already sent it, he said. I did. Without telling me. I told you after, she said. I wasn't sure you'd let me send it if I asked first. His jaw worked. For a moment she genuinely couldn't tell which way it would go, whether he'd be angry about the presumption, whether the part of him that had fought this battle alone for 2 years would bristle at someone acting on his behalf without permission. Then he said, What did it say? She told him carefully, word for word, what she'd written. He was quiet through all of it. When she finished, he picked up his coffee cup and drank from it and set it down. He said, "That's a good letter. Thank you. I would have wanted to change 2 things." "Which 2?" he told her. She listened. He was right about one of them and wrong about the other, and she said so clearly and explained why. Listened to her explanation with the full attention of a man who knew how to take in information he hadn't thought of himself. "Fair enough," he said. "The response will take time," she said. "Weeks, maybe more. In the meantime, Clay is going to do something. He's not a patient man under pressure, and we've put him under pressure." "What do you think he'll do?" "I think he'll try to discredit one of us, or both." She paused. "Probably me." Caleb went still. "Why you?" "Because I'm newer. Because I'm a woman from Kentucky nobody in this county knows. Because I have no established credibility here, and he has years of it." She said it without self-pity, just as analysis. "If he can make the town doubt my competence, my motives, my background, then what I observed at the creek becomes questionable. And if what I observed is questionable, Harriet Beale's statement is questionable. And then he walks away clean." "That won't happen," Caleb said. "I know it won't," she said, "but it'll be attempted. We should be ready for it." She saw him processing this, the particular way he worked through things, turning them over, finding the edges of them. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" The question landed simply. What do you need from me? Not what should I do? Not, I'll handle it. What do you need? She thought about how long it had probably been since anyone had asked him that. "I need you to stand beside me in public when it starts," she said. "Not in front. Beside." He looked at her steadily. "Done," he said. It started on a Sunday, which struck Eleanor as either ironic or appropriate, depending on how you felt about things happening on the Lord's Day. They had gone to church in Cedar Bluff the first time Eleanor had attended, Caleb going, because he went most Sundays. Eleanor going because she understood that appearing in public as a unit mattered in a town like this, and because she wasn't going to hide in the ranch house while someone built a case against her. The service was ordinary. The minister was a decent man who preached without fire or particular inspiration, but managed to be sincere, which was enough. Eleanor sat beside Caleb in the pew and kept her hands folded and her attention forward, aware of the looks from the surrounding pews. The way you're aware of weather, not looking directly at it, just registering it. After the service in the churchyard was when it happened. Mrs. Aldine Marsh, with the precision of someone who had planned the moment, placed herself in the path between Eleanor and the churchyard gate, with 2 other women flanking her in the natural, uncontrived way that meant it had been contrived entirely. "Miss Hayes," she said, loudly enough to be heard. "I've been hearing some concerning things." Eleanor stopped. Beside her, Caleb stopped. "Is that right?" Eleanor said. "About your background, where you studied, what you actually know about medicine and livestock treatment." Mrs. Marsh's voice was carrying in the way voices do when their owner intends them to carry. "Some people are saying that what happened to Caleb's horses wasn't a water problem at all, that perhaps an inexperienced woman meddling with things she doesn't understand made the situation worse." The churchyard had gone the particular kind of quiet that crowds go when they sense a confrontation. Eleanor felt Caleb shift his weight beside her. She put one hand very briefly on his arm, not restraining, just present, and then addressed Mrs. Marsh directly. "My grandmother was the only medical knowledge in a 60-mile radius for 30 years, she said. "My mother treated livestock and people in Harlan County, Kentucky for 22 years. I have been studying plant medicine, water quality, and animal illness since I was 8 years old. Not in a school, Mrs. Marsh in the field with real sick animals, under the instruction of someone who got results or people died." She paused. 6 horses that were failing are now recovering. The water source has been identified and fixed. And Harriet Beale's horses who were showing the same symptoms are improving on the same protocol. She let a beat pass. "I'm not sure what else you'd need to know about my qualifications." Mrs. Marsh's chin went up. "It's not just your qualifications that are in question. Your methods. Your Mrs. Marsh. Caleb's voice, quiet and absolute, cut across whatever was coming next. He stepped forward, not in front of Eleanor, but beside her, exactly as she'd asked. This woman came to my ranch at my request. She has worked without sleep to save my livestock and my water supply. She has conducted herself with more competence and more grace than I had any right to expect, and I will not stand in a churchyard and listen to her be publicly questioned for things she's done nothing but demonstrate. He held Mrs. Marsh's gaze. I'd appreciate it if you'd say whatever else you've got to say directly to me, since we've known each other long enough for that. Mrs. Marsh opened her mouth, closed it. The churchyard was absolutely still. Then from somewhere behind Eleanor, a woman's voice said, "My cousin's boy had a bad cough last winter. Eleanor left medicine at their door without being asked. Didn't charge for it." Eleanor turned slightly. A young woman, late 20s, someone she'd spoken to briefly after the service, was standing a few feet away. Another woman, older, spoke from near the gate. "My Hattie showed me the letter Eleanor wrote to the land commissioner. That takes nerve. And sense." A pause. I trust Harriet Beale's eyes before I trust gossip. Mrs. Marsh looked around the churchyard. She looked at the faces looking back at her. Whatever she'd expected agreement, a ripple of support, was not materializing the way she'd planned it. She straightened. She looked at Eleanor. And for one brief moment before the mask of propriety came back, Eleanor saw something in her face that wasn't malice, it was loss. Old and specific, the kind a woman carries when she's spent years deciding what should be and has watched it consistently not be. "Good day, Miss Hayes," she said, and turned and walked away. Her two companions following in her wake, like the tide after a ship. The churchyard let out its breath. Caleb said very quietly, "You all right?" "I'm fine," Eleanor said. She was. Her heart was moving faster than usual, but that was just mechanics, not damage. "Were you—" He looked at her sideways. "Me?" "You said things you can't unsay, in public, about me." He was quiet for a moment. "I know." "You meant them. Every word." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," and turned toward the gate. It was Ruiz who came to find her that evening, quiet, as he always was, appearing at the kitchen doorway, where she was working on her notes. "Miss Eleanor," he said. He had the particular formality of a man who had been taught to be careful with names and kept the habit. "There is something at the south fence." She looked up. "What kind of something?" He glanced toward the main house. "The gate. It is open. And there are tracks, horse tracks, several coming from the south." Eleanor stood. "When?" "Today. I think this morning, from the look of the soil." She put her notebook down and went to find Caleb. He was at the gate within 20 minutes, crouched over the tracks in the fading light, reading them the way he read everything, quietly, completely. Hank was beside him with a lantern. "4 horses," Caleb said. "Ridden in together. They went to the upper creek." He stood. "The spring." Eleanor felt something cold move through her. The spring they were piping from. "If someone disturbs the source," she said, "breaks the pipe where it draws." 2 days of work and 2 weeks' worth of pipe fittings, Caleb said. His voice was controlled. She could hear what was underneath it. They went up the hill at a run. The pipe was intact. Whoever had come through the south gate had approached the spring and then, for whatever reason, spooked maybe, or interrupted, had not completed whatever they'd come to do. The draw point was undamaged. The pipe ran clean, but the tracks around the spring were fresh and clear and numerous. Caleb stood at the spring's edge and looked at them for a long time. "He's escalating," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "This was a message." "Yes." He turned to look at her. His face in the lantern light was something she'd learned to read over these days, not the closed, unreadable face she'd first met at the train platform, but something more present, more open, as though the last 10 days had worn through the outer layer of him to something rawer and realer underneath. "I'm not going to let him take this place," he said. It wasn't anger. It was something beyond anger, the particular conviction of a man who has found the bottom of himself and discovered it's solid. "I know," she said. "Whatever comes next." "Whatever comes next," she said. "We're standing here when it does." He looked at her. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train and found a man with a lathered horse and a face that was holding too much, what she saw in his expression wasn't the grief or the stubborn endurance. It was something newer and more fragile and more real than any of those things. It was the look of a man who had begun slowly against his own better judgment to believe that he wasn't going to be alone in this anymore. She held his gaze and let him have that. Didn't rush past it. Didn't make it smaller by moving on too fast. The lantern burned between them on the hillside above Morgan Ridge, and the stars came out over the hill country the way they always did, indifferent and enormous, and below them the spring moved clear and cold over limestone undisturbed still theirs. For now. But Weston Clay had shown his hand tonight, and they both knew that whatever was coming, it was not finished. It was only just beginning. The storm came without proper warning. That was the thing about Texas hill country in high summer. The sky could be clear and brutal at noon, and by 4 in the afternoon, something would be building in the southwest that had no interest in announcing itself. Caleb had seen it before. He knew the particular stillness that came before the way the air changed pressure without changing temperature, the way the horses got restless an hour out without knowing why. He noticed it at 3 in the afternoon and said nothing, because he thought he had time. He was wrong. By 5 o'clock, the sky to the southwest had gone the color of a bruise, green-edged and moving fast, and the wind that had been sitting still all day stood up and started pushing. Caleb came out of the barn and looked at it and said one word under his breath that he would not have said in Eleanor's presence, and then he started moving. "Eddie," he called, "get the horses in. All of them. Now." Eddie came out of the tack room, looked at the sky, and didn't ask questions. He went at a run. Hank appeared from the direction of the south fence, where he'd been doing a check since the previous night's gate incident. He took one look at the clouds and reversed direction toward the barn. Eleanor came out of the house onto the porch and stood looking at the sky. "How bad?" she called. "Bad enough," Caleb said. He was already pulling the barn doors wider. "Get inside. Get everything you've got in the herb room secured. If that roof vents, it'll go through there first." She looked at him. Then she looked at the sky again. Then she went back inside, not running, but moving with the particular efficiency of a woman who assessed situations quickly and acted on them. Caleb didn't watch her go. He was already in the barn. The horses knew. They always knew, before people did the ears going flat, the restless shifting, the particular tension that ran through a horse's body when the air pressure dropped fast. He and Eddie moved through the stalls together, checking latches, pulling the water buckets back from the edges, laying extra straw in the back stalls where the 2 weakest horses were still recovering. Drummer was at his stall door, ears back, eyes wide, and showing white at the edges. "Easy," Caleb said, stopping at the door, putting his hand on the horse's neck. "Easy. You're in. You're all right." Drummer pressed his head into Caleb's chest with a force that was almost desperate, not the affectionate gesture of a healthy horse, but the honest fear of an animal that was not yet well enough to feel brave. "I've got you," Caleb said, quiet and direct. "You made it through the fever. You can make it through a storm." The wind hit the barn's west wall like a hand slapping a table. Not the worst of it, just the advance. The structure shook once, settled, held. Hank was at the far end of the barn, resecuring the emergency latch on the double doors at the south end. "We got maybe 20 minutes before the main of it," he said. "The roof section over the east stalls," Caleb said. "The patch we did in April." "I know," Hank said. He already had rope in his hands. Eleanor had secured the herb room in less time than Caleb had expected. She'd moved her preparations into the lower cabinet under the work table. The glass jars laid flat, the paper packets wrapped in oilcloth, the notebook tucked inside the tin box she kept it in for exactly this kind of situation. Because you learned early in Harlan County that weather respected nothing you hadn't protected. She came to the barn at the 15-minute mark. Caleb looked up from where he was helping Hank run a secondary brace along the east roof's interior supports and said, "I told you to stay inside." "You told me to secure the herb room," she said. "It's secured." She looked at the east roof. "What's the weak point?" "April patch," Hank said from his position on the ladder. "It'll hold it normal, but if we get rotation." "What do you need?" "Another set of hands on this line," Hank said. He wasn't asking Caleb's permission. He looked at Eleanor and held out one end of the rope. She took it. Caleb looked at both of them. He knew he could tell her to leave. He knew she wouldn't go. He understood with the particular clarity that arrives in emergency situations that the time for protecting Eleanor Hayes from the difficulty of this ranch was already past, possibly had never existed, possibly had been an assumption he'd made about a woman he hadn't yet met. "Pull it taut and hold position," he said. "When I say tie off, can you do a double hitch?" "Can you?" she said. Something crossed his face, half exasperation, half something warmer than he intended to show. "Pull the rope," he said. She pulled the rope. They worked through the next 10 minutes in near silence, just voices where they had to be. Hank calling positions. Caleb calling instructions. Eleanor following both without argument and without hesitation. The wind was building outside in the way summer storms build in Texas hill country, not gradually, but in surges, each one stronger than the last, separated by a brief false calm that made you think you'd seen the worst of it. The horses were loud, not panicking. Caleb's horses were working horses, not delicate, but vocal, restless, aware. Drummer was the loudest, banging his front hooves against the stall door, with a rhythm that wasn't quite rhythm, the way frightened animals sometimes found repetition when they couldn't find calm. "He's going to hurt himself," Eleanor said without stopping what she was doing with the rope. "He's done it before," Caleb said. "He knows his limits." She didn't argue. She filed it away. The roof patch held through the first surge. It held through the second. On the third surge, which arrived without the false calm warning and hit the barn from two directions at once, west wall and south end simultaneously, which meant the storm had some rotation in it, the patch groaned, loudly. The kind of structural sound that isn't a warning so much as an announcement. "Hank," Caleb said. "I hear it." Eleanor dropped the rope and moved back. "I'm holding drop the rope and move back now." She moved back. The section of roof over stalls, 9 through 11. 3 stalls at the east end, the farthest from where the horses currently were, gave way with the sound of 100 things happening at once. The supports cracked first, then the boards, then the roofing material itself tore loose and went, and the opening it left was maybe 8 feet wide and 4 feet of sky suddenly visible in the middle of the barn. And rain came through it immediately, horizontal and cold and hard, in a way that was shocking after the weeks of dry heat. Hank was on the ladder. The ladder went sideways. Caleb moved before he thought about it, crossing the distance in 3 strides and getting his shoulder under the ladder's fall, taking the weight of it and Hank together, and going to one knee with the impact, not dropping it, but not stopping it gracefully either. Hank came off the ladder and landed on his feet and one hand, and stayed down for a moment, breathing hard. "Hank!" Caleb crouched beside him. "Talk to me." "I'm down," Hank said. "Not out." He looked up. His face was pale. "My shoulder." "Can you move it?" Hank tried. His jaw clamped shut, and his eyes went tight. "Not without—" He stopped. "Not much." Eleanor was already there. She'd come across the barn the moment Hank went down, and she was crouching beside him now, one hand on his back, looking at his face with the focused, rapid attention she brought to anything that was hurt. "Tell me where," she said. "Top," Hank said through his teeth. "Like a burning." "Separated shoulder," she said. "Not broken. Can you get to the tack room? I need you sitting and braced." "I'm not—" "You can't use that arm, and we need to clear this barn," she said. "You'll be more useful to us in 10 minutes after I've said it than you are right now. Go." Hank looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "Go, Hank." He went. The barn was chaos. The rain coming through the roof gap was already pooling in the east stalls. Not dangerous yet, but it would be. The stall floors had drainage, but not for horizontal rain at this volume. The horses in the adjacent stalls were responding to the roof breach with the full force of their unease, and two of them were pulling at the ropes with the committed energy of animals that had decided the barn was no longer a safe place and were making their case for leaving. Caleb went to the nearest one first. He talked to the horse the way he talked to all of them, direct, low, authoritative, and got a hand on the halter and held it while the animal sorted out the difference between genuine danger and perceived danger. It took 3 minutes. 3 minutes was a long time in a barn with an open roof and a storm throwing itself against the walls. Eddie appeared from the south end with 2 feed buckets, which was exactly the right instinct. Familiar objects, familiar smell. He went down the row of stalls, distributing them with the efficient calm of a young man who had finally found a situation that matched his pace. Eleanor came back from the tack room in 4 minutes. She moved to the far stall where the youngest horse, a bay mare who had come through the illness but was still rebuilding strength, had gotten her lead rope wrapped around the stall support in her panic. "Don't untie her," Caleb called. "I'm not untying her, I'm unwrapping her," Eleanor called back. He watched for 1 second, just one, while she went to work on the rope with both hands, talking to the mare, at the same time her voice steady and low under the noise of the storm, and the mare visibly dropped 2 degrees of panic in response to it. He turned back to his own work. The roof gap was getting worse. Not structurally, the main roof was holding, but the opening was large enough that the wind was starting to use it, creating cross-currents inside the barn that disturbed everything and everybody. "We need something over that gap," Caleb said to the barn at large, to no one specific. "Tarpaulin," Eddie said. "In the back of the equipment room. 2 of them, big ones." "Get them." Eddie went. Caleb looked at the gap. Getting a tarpaulin over that opening from the inside would require someone on a ladder in a barn full of agitated horses during a storm, which was categorically not a good idea. Eleanor appeared at his elbow. "Tarpaulin on the outside," she said. "Not inside. You go up the exterior ladder on the north side, get on the low section of the roof, and weight the edges from outside. It won't be perfect, but it'll cut the cross current." He looked at her. "That's a better idea than mine." "What was yours?" "Inside ladder." "Much worse," she said. "Go. I'll handle the horses." "Eleanor." "Caleb." She looked at him straight. "I have been in this barn for the past 10 days. I know every one of these horses by name and disposition. Go fix the roof." He went. The exterior of the barn in a Texas hill country storm was a different world from the inside. Caleb got up the north ladder with the tarpaulin under one arm and the wind trying to make decisions about his hat for him. He pulled himself onto the lower roof section and moved toward the breach on his hands and knees. Standing was not an option, not with the gusts coming unpredictably from rotation, and he could feel the structure under him vibrating with each surge, not alarmingly, but noticeably the way solid things register force without yielding to it. The breach was bigger from the outside than he'd visualized. The April patch had gone completely, taking 2 of the original boards with it. The gap was jagged-edged, and water was streaming through it in sheets. He got the tarpaulin unrolled with the wind fighting him for it at every step. He got the first edge weighted with the coping stones he'd had the presence of mind to grab from the roof's edge, heavy flat limestone blocks that had been sitting there as architectural finishing for 15 years and were finally earning their place. Second edge. Third. The fourth edge required him to move across the breach, which meant his hands and knees on roof boards with open space below him and a storm doing its level best to introduce him to the ground from height. He moved across it. He got the fourth edge weighted. The tarpaulin held. The cross-current inside the barn died in the way a draft dies when you close a window, suddenly completely leaving a different quality of air in its wake. From inside, he heard the horses go quieter. He climbed down. Eleanor had Hank's shoulder back in its socket by the time Caleb came through the barn door. He knew because Hank was sitting against the tack room wall, with his eyes closed, and the particular gray, wrung-out look of a man who had been through something acutely painful and come out the other side. Eleanor was kneeling beside him, wrapping his shoulder in strips of oilcloth she'd found somewhere, her hands quick and efficient. "How'd you do that?" Caleb asked. "My mother taught me," Eleanor said. She didn't look up. Dislocated shoulders were common enough in Harlan County. Mining country. Men fell. She tied off the wrap. "He needs to rest it for 3 days, which means no heavy work. He can still ride." Hank opened his eyes. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that Caleb had never seen on Hank Pruitt's face, before something unguarded and direct, the look of a man reevaluating something significant. "Thank you," Hank said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "It'll hurt worse tomorrow when the swelling sets in." She sat back on her heels. "Where's Eddie?" "West stalls," Caleb said. "He's good. Horses are good." She nodded. She stood, and for the first time in the hours since the storm had started, she was still. She stood in the middle of the tack room and let herself be still for a moment, and Caleb watched the exhaustion move through her. Not collapse, not weakness, just the honest weight of a person who had been running on nerve and competence and was letting herself acknowledge it for 60 seconds before going back to work. He crossed the tack room and stood in front of her. She looked up at him. "You're hurt," he said. Not a question. He'd seen her favor her left hand twice in the last hour. "Rope burn," she said. "From the brace. It's nothing." He reached out and took her left hand, turning it palm up. The rope had caught her across the base of the fingers, not deep, but raw and torn, in a way that would hurt for days. He held her hand in both of his. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at it. "This," he said quietly, "is not nothing." She didn't pull her hand back. She looked at their hands together for a moment, his large and rough, hers smaller but not delicate, both of them marked by the same rope from the same crisis. "I've had worse," she said. "I know you have," he said. "That's not the point." She looked up at him. The lantern light in the tack room caught his face, and she saw there what she'd been catching glimpses of for days. The thing he hadn't said yet, because he hadn't found the right container for it, or because he was still deciding whether he was allowed to feel it. The storm was still going outside. Not as violent now, the worst had passed over the way the worst things do, and left the regular difficult version of itself behind. Rain on the roof, steady and cold. Wind at the corners, still deliberate but without malice. Inside the barn, horses breathed. Hank was asleep against the wall. It was just the two of them for that particular moment, and Caleb Morgan was holding Eleanor Hayes's hurt hand in both of his, and neither of them was moving. "I don't know how to do this," he said. His voice was very quiet, not ashamed, just honest in the way he'd been honest from the first letter, direct, unembellished, a man saying exactly what he meant, because he didn't know how to say less. "I knew how to do it with Catherine. I learned it over years, and then I lost it when I lost her, and I've been—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I've been an empty barn for 2 years. Just walls and a roof and nothing living in it," Eleanor said. "You've been a barn in a drought. That's different from empty." He looked at her. "Drought ends," she said. "Things that were dormant start again. That's not recovery. That's just nature doing what nature does." She held his gaze. "You don't have to know how to do this, Caleb. Neither do I. We just have to not run from it." He absorbed that, the way he absorbed everything completely without rushing. Then he said, "I'm not running." "I know," she said. "I noticed that about you early on." The almost smile. And this time it didn't disappear. It stayed small and real, and not yet comfortable with itself on the face of a man who had forgotten he was capable of it. He set her hand down gently. He went and found the clean linen she kept in her kit, and bandaged her rope burn the way she'd bandaged Hank's shoulder, carefully, without drama, just doing what was needed. The storm finished itself by 10 o'clock. Not gracefully. Texas storms didn't do graceful exits. but it moved off northeast and left behind the particular washed clean quality of air after high summer rain, cool and specific, and smelling of wet cedar and limestone. The horses settled. Eddie went to his bunk without being told the specific unconsciousness of a young man who has burned through every reserve he had and is now simply finished. Caleb walked the property with Hank's lantern checking fence lines, and the spring pipe, and the south. The spring pipe was intact. The south gate was latched. The fence on the east quarter had 3 posts down where the wind had taken them, which was a week's work, but it was fixable. When he came back to the house, Eleanor was at the kitchen table. She had her notebook open, and she was writing in it by lamplight, but she looked up when he came in, and he saw immediately that she'd been waiting too. "Everything's standing," he said. She let out a breath. "The east stalls. I'll start on the roof tomorrow. Eddie can help. It's a 3-day job, maybe 4. She nodded. She looked at him. "You should sleep. So should you." Neither of them moved immediately. Then she said, "Caleb, I need to tell you something." He took his hat off and set it on the table and sat down. "Tell me." "When I was in the tack room with Hank," she said, "while you were on the roof he talked. Hank talked more than he's talked in all the time I've been here." She paused. "He said Clay made an approach to him 2 months ago, before I arrived." Caleb went still. "He offered Hank money to report on the ranch, the state of the livestock, the water situation, the finances." She held Caleb's gaze. "Hank said no. He wanted me to know that. He wanted me to tell you because he said he'd told you before about things, and you didn't always hear them when you were carrying too much." Caleb was quiet for a long time. "2 months ago," he said. "Yes." "That would be when the water started going wrong." "Yes." Another silence. Heavier. Not between them, the weight wasn't between them. It was behind Caleb, the weight of understanding that the threat had been in motion longer than he'd known, that the timing was more deliberate than even he'd suspected. "Clay had a man on the inside," Caleb said. "He thought he did. He didn't know Hank said no, which means he may have been operating on incomplete information," Eleanor said. "He thought he knew how bad things were here. He may not have known how much had changed." Caleb looked at her. "You." "Information takes time to travel," she said simply. "If he's been watching this ranch through old intelligence—" "He underestimated what you do here," Caleb said. "He underestimated what we do here," she said. Together, the lamp between them burned steady and warm. Outside, rain still dripped from the eaves in the rhythmic way it does after a storm, irregular at first, then finding its tempo, then slowing. Caleb said, "The land commissioner response could take weeks more," she said. "I know. Clay won't wait that long, not after the gate, not after I turned him down in front of everyone." He thought for a moment. "He'll make a move on the water rights directly. Try to file a claim that Morgan Ridge's spring is part of the Double C watershed." "Can he do that?" "He can file anything. Whether it holds is different." He rubbed his jaw. "I need to get to Abilene, talk to someone who knows water law in this territory. A lawyer, not just the commissioner's office. How long would that take?" "Day there, day back. Day with the lawyer if I'm lucky." She held his gaze. "Go. I'll hold this place." He looked at her. 3 days. You'd be here 3 days without Caleb. Her voice was patient, but exact. "I have held Drummer through a fever relapse and a storm. I have reduced a dislocated shoulder in a tack room with horse sounds for background music. I have faced down Aldine Marsh in a churchyard and Weston Clay in a front yard. I can hold this ranch for 3 days." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not going to let me argue this," he said. "You're not going to argue it," she said, "because you know I'm right." He didn't argue it. He left at dawn. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched him ride out Hank with his good arm and his gimlet eye at the fence line, Eddie already making noise in the barn. Ruiz starting the morning fire in the cookhouse. She went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window for 5 minutes, doing nothing but drinking it, which was all the stillness she allotted herself. Then she went to work. The first 2 days went, as days went on a working ranch full of small crises and physical labor, and the particular rhythm of people who know their jobs. The east roof repair was underway. The horses were doing well. Drummer was growing visibly stronger, eating fully for the first time, showing the personality that Caleb had told her was characteristic of him, obstinate, curious with the particular dignity of a horse that knew it was important. She talked to him while she checked on him. She didn't tell anyone she did this. Harriet Beale came by on the second day with an update on her own horse's fully recovered water, switched to a cleaner draw, and a note she handed Eleanor without much preamble. "My husband rode Clay's fence line yesterday," Harriet said. "He found something I think you need to know." Eleanor opened the note. It was in Harriet's husband's handwriting square. Careful letters from a man who didn't write much. It said, "Pipe on Clay property has been removed." Bank disturbed again. Fresh wagon tracks heading south toward the main road. Something was moved out in a hurry. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. "He's removing the evidence," she said. Harriet's face was flat and certain. "That's what Robert thinks. Then we don't have much time." Eleanor looked at Harriet. "Would Robert be willing to put this in writing?" "What he saw, the dates, the wagon tracks." "He already wrote it once," Harriet said. "I mean formally, witnessed, sworn." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "If Clay finds out Robert made a sworn statement." "I know what I'm asking," Eleanor said. "I'm asking anyway because it's the only thing that matters right now." Harriet looked at her, the long assessing look of a woman who had spent years deciding who was worth the risk of standing beside. "I'll ask him," she said. "I think you know what he'll say." "I think I do," Eleanor said. Harriet left. Eleanor went inside and wrote 2 letters, one to Caleb at the hotel in Abilene, she'd made him write the address of before he left, and one to the land commissioner's office directly marked urgent enclosing Robert Beale's note and requesting an immediate investigative visit before evidence was further removed. She sealed both letters and gave them to Ruiz to take to town, and then she went back to the barn and sat with Drummer for 20 minutes because sometimes a person needed to sit somewhere quiet and breathe. The horse pressed his nose into her shoulder. "I know," she said. "Me too." Caleb came back on the evening of the 3rd day. Not at the end of the day, in the middle of it, earlier than she'd expected, which meant something had happened in Abilene to change his timeline. She heard him coming before she saw him, the familiar rhythm of his horse on the dry road, and she was on the porch when he rode in. He dismounted. He looked at her. His face was different than when he'd left. Not worse, not better, but different. The particular tight-wound expression of a man who had received information he'd both hoped for and feared. "The lawyer," she said. "What did he say?" Caleb tied his horse and came up the porch steps. He stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the road dust on him, the 3 days of it, the marks of a fast ride home. He said the spring rights are unambiguously Morgan Ridge's, he said. "No argument. The original land patent is clear." He paused. "He also said Clay has filed a water harassment complaint against me. Claimed I've been deliberately diverting creek flow to damage the Double C." Eleanor stared at him. "He filed against you." "He filed against me," Caleb said, "for the exact thing he's been doing to us, word for word." The boldness of it took even her a moment to absorb. "He's got the commissioner's office in his pocket," she said. "One man in it," Caleb said. "The deputy commissioner, not the commissioner himself." He held her gaze. "The lawyer said, if we can get our evidence to the commissioner directly bypassing the deputy, and if we've got witnesses sworn documented." "Robert Beale sent a letter," she said. "I wrote to the commissioner directly, yesterday." Caleb went still. She pulled the copy she'd kept from her coat pocket and handed it to him. He read it. He read it again. "You wrote this yesterday," he said. "I wrote it when I found out Clay was removing the pipe," she said. Harriet Beale came with her husband's note. "I sent both letters with Ruiz to town." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the letter. She watched his face move through several things she didn't have names for yet. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes, this might have just saved everything." She didn't say anything dramatic. She said, "We saved it. You went to Abilene and got the legal footing. I sent the letters. Robert Beale saw the pipe. Harriet Beale walked the fence. Hank said no to Clay 2 months ago." She held his gaze. "You had good people around you all along, Caleb. You just hadn't had anyone to organize them." He looked at her for a long time. The evening light was doing what it did on the hill country, going gold and long-shadowed and generous in the way it wasn't generous at noon. "Is that what you are?" he asked. His voice was quiet with an edge of something that wasn't quite a question. "I'm your wife," she said. "Which I'm told includes the organizing." The look on his face then was something she would carry for a long time. Not the relief of a man who'd been saved, but the arrival of a man who had been walking in the dark for 2 years and had finally come through to somewhere with light. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just the simple, complete presence of a man who had found solid ground under his feet again and recognized the particular feeling of it. He reached out and covered her bandaged hand with his, the rope burn she'd taken in the storm wrapped now in clean linen. He held it carefully. Not as he'd held it in the tack room assessing damage. As a man holds something that belongs to him and that he intends to protect. "I'm not going to be easy," he said. "I should tell you that straight." "I know that," she said. "I saw the letter you sent." The ghost of that almost smile. "You said that before." "It keeps being true." He held her hand. She held his. The light went gold around Morgan Ridge, and the horses were alive, and the spring was running clean, and the roof was being rebuilt board by board. And somewhere in Abilene, a lawyer had the legal foundations of a fight they were now actually prepared to win. It wasn't over. Weston Clay had not made his last move. The commissioner's office had not yet responded. There were 3 fence posts down on the east quarter, and a barn roof still in progress, and weeks of difficulty almost certainly still ahead. But for the first time since Eleanor Hayes had stepped off a train into a dying world, she stood on the porch of Morgan Ridge and felt the particular weight of a thing that was going to hold. Not hoping it would hold. Knowing. And Caleb Morgan, mountain cowboy rancher widower, man of few words and absolute honesty, stood beside her with his hand over hers and looked at his land in the evening light and breathed. Just breathed. Like a man who had remembered how. The letter from the land commissioner's office arrived on a Tuesday. Ruiz brought it from town with the morning supply run, set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, and went back outside. Eleanor was in the herb room. Caleb was at the barn. Neither of them saw it arrive. It was Eddie who found it. He stood in the kitchen doorway holding it with both hands and called out with the particular volume of a young man who understood the weight of an envelope without fully understanding its contents. "Caleb, you'd better come in." Caleb came in from the barn with his work gloves still on. He stopped at the table and looked at the envelope. The commissioner's seal was on the front, official formal, the kind of envelope that settled things one way or another. He didn't open it immediately. Eleanor appeared from the herb room doorway. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Caleb. She crossed the kitchen and stood beside him without touching him the way she'd learned he sometimes needed present but not pushing. "Open it," she said quietly. He pulled off one glove and picked up the envelope and opened it with the particular controlled steadiness of a man who has learned to receive news without bracing against it, because bracing never changed what the news was. He read it once. He read it again. His face gave nothing away for the first 10 seconds. Then he set the letter on the table and said, "They're sending an investigator." Eleanor picked it up and read it herself. The language was official and measured the way government language always was. But what it said underneath the formal phrasing was clear enough. The commissioner's office had received her letter, and Robert Beale's sworn statement. They had also, the letter noted, received 3 additional complaints from downstream landowners about the creek water complaints that Eleanor had not known about, which meant others had found the same problem and reported it independently. The investigator would arrive within 2 weeks. All parties were instructed to preserve evidence and refrain from further alterations to the creek or its banks. The last line noted that the deputy commissioner had recused himself from the case, pending a review of his relationship with Double C Ranch. Eleanor set the letter down. "He's losing his man inside," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Clay will know that by now. Or will know it soon." "Yes." She looked at him. "He's going to move before the investigator arrives. He's going to do something fast." Caleb picked up his glove from the table. He put it back on. He looked at Eleanor with the calm, measured expression of a man who had made his decisions and was now simply waiting for the moment that required him to act on them. "Let him," he said. Clay moved in 3 days. He didn't come himself this time. He sent his ranch foreman, a man named Daltrey, that Hank knew from years back and did not respect, which he communicated to Eleanor with a single look when Daltrey rode in on a Thursday morning with 2 Double C hands behind him. Daltrey asked for Caleb at the yard. Caleb came out. Eleanor came out behind him and stood on the porch steps and didn't move. Daltrey was a tall, lean man with the particular ease of someone delivering a message he's been paid to deliver and bears no personal responsibility for. He held a document in his hand, folded official-looking, and he held it out toward Caleb. "Mr. Clay's legal team filed this morning," Daltrey said. "It's a water rights injunction. Claims Morgan Ridge has been diverting spring flow from the Double C watershed. Judge Harlan signed it this morning." Caleb took the document. He opened it. He read it. Eleanor watched his jaw. She could read his jaw now, the way she read the creek, the tightness that meant restraint, the working motion that meant he was thinking through something rather than reacting to it. "Judge Harlan," Caleb said, "out of Cedar Bluff." "That's right," Daltrey said. "Not Abilene." A slight hesitation. "Local jurisdiction." "The spring on my property," Caleb said, "was established in the original Morgan Ridge land patent filed in 1871. It predates the Double C by 11 years. He folded the document and held it back out to Daltrey. "Take this back to your employer and tell him to have his legal team look at patent date 1-871-CR-44 in the Territorial Land Office. Then have them explain to Judge Harlan what prior appropriation doctrine means in the state of Texas." Daltrey didn't take the document. "Mr. Clay's legal team is confident." "I'm sure they are," Caleb said. "They're also wrong." He held the document steady in the air between them. "Tell him I said so." Daltrey took the document. He looked past Caleb at Eleanor for a moment, a brief look, the kind that was taking inventory. Eleanor held his gaze without expression. Daltrey turned his horse. His 2 men turned with him. They rode south without looking back. Caleb stood in the yard until they cleared the property gate. Then he turned and walked back to the porch. He stopped at the bottom step and looked up at Eleanor. "I need to wire my lawyer in Abilene," he said. "Ruiz can take the wire to town," she said. "What do you want to say?" He told her. She went inside and wrote it, and Ruiz was on the road to Cedar Bluff within the hour. The response came back by evening. The lawyer's wire was brief because wires were brief, but what it said was enough. Prior appropriation doctrine was unambiguous. The 1871 patent would override any local injunction. Judge Harlan had no jurisdiction over a territorial water rights dispute that sat with the Federal Land Commission. The injunction, the lawyer said, was a bluff. A well-financed bluff, but a bluff. Caleb read the wire at the kitchen table with Hank beside him and Eleanor across from them. Hank's shoulder was still wrapped, but he'd recovered most of his range and had stopped mentioning it, which meant it was healing properly. He read the wire over Caleb's shoulder and said, "So Clay went to a local judge because he couldn't get traction at the federal level." "Because the federal level is now looking at him," Eleanor said, "not at us." "He's panicking," Hank said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Panicking men do the thing that feels powerful instead of the thing that's strategic. That's why he sent Daltrey with an injunction that won't hold." She paused. It's also why he'll do something else, something that feels powerful, before the investigator arrives. Like what? Eddie asked from the doorway. He'd been listening from the hall, which all of them knew, and none of them had mentioned. I don't know yet, Eleanor said. But it won't be quiet. She was right about that. It wasn't quiet. 2 nights later, at close to midnight, Caleb with a knock on his door and 4 words, "Fire, south fence line." Caleb was dressed and out of the house in 2 minutes. Eleanor was 30 seconds behind him. The fire was not at the barn. She confirmed that first, her eyes going there. Immediately, the horses, always the horses, but at the south field, where the dry summer grass had caught along a fence line that ran close to the Double C property. Not an accident. The grass was too dry, the wind too specific, the location too deliberate. Caleb had the bucket line organized before Eleanor reached him himself, and Eddie and Ruiz, working from the trough water, beating back the perimeter of it with wet feed sacks, while Hank, one-armed and furious, managed the water flow. It was the kind of fire that wanted to run, but hadn't gotten the momentum yet, and they had caught it early enough that it was fighting its own lack of wind rather than feeding on it. Eleanor joined the line without being asked. She beat at the grass fire's edge with a wet sack until her arms ached and her face felt the heat from 6 feet away, and she kept going, because stopping was not an option, and because somewhere on the other side of the south fence, a man had sent someone to light a fire on land that was hers now too, and that particular knowledge was sufficient fuel to keep her moving. They killed it in 40 minutes. 40 minutes is a long time to fight a fire. It's not a long time to lose a ranch. After they stood in the dark and the smoke and looked at what remained, the fence line was down along a 30-foot section. The grass was black and still smoking. The air smelled like the end of something. Caleb stood at the edge of it, with a wet sack still in his hand, and didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, "That's enough." His voice was quiet, not loud, not hot, not the sharp edge of fresh anger. The settled, final, absolute quiet of a man who has arrived at the bottom of his patience and found it replaced by something harder. "Caleb," Hank said. "No," Caleb said. "I mean it. That's enough." He turned around and looked at all of them. Hank, Eddie, Ruiz, Eleanor, in the particular way a leader looks at people when he's about to say something that isn't a suggestion. "Tomorrow morning I ride to Cedar Bluff. I talk to the sheriff. I tell him what happened tonight, and I tell him everything else, and I file a report for the record, whether he acts on it or not. Then I wire the investigator directly and tell him the timeline has changed." He looked at Eleanor last. She held his gaze. "You need a witness account of tonight," she said. "All of us. Written, signed tonight while it's fresh." "Yes." "I'll write them," she said. "Bring me everyone." She went inside and got paper and pen and sat at the kitchen table, while Caleb brought them in one at a time. Ruiz first, then Eddie, then Hank, then himself last. She wrote what each of them said in clear, plain language, asked her questions without leading them, and had each man sign his name at the bottom. When Caleb sat across from her and told her what he'd seen, she wrote it down word for word and slid the paper across to him. He read it. He looked up. "That's exactly right," he said. "I know," she said. "I wrote what you said." He signed it. She gathered all 5 statements, including her own, which she wrote last, and which described the fire from her own point of arrival, and put them in the oilcloth-wrapped packet she kept for documents. It was 2 a.m. They had been awake for going on 20 hours between them. "Go to bed," she said. "Eleanor, I'll sit up another hour in case the fire kicks back," she said. "Ruiz already offered. Between the 2 of us, we've got it. Go." He didn't argue. He was too tired to argue, and she could see that, and she used it fairly. He stood. He paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at her, the same look she'd been learning to read, the one that didn't have a clean name for it yet, the one that was something like gratitude but deeper and less comfortable with itself, because it had more at stake than gratitude usually did. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said. "Go to bed, Caleb." The ghost of a smile. And then he was gone. Yeah. Sheriff Moss of Cedar Bluff was not a complicated man, and Eleanor decided within 4 minutes of meeting him that this was both his limitation and his virtue. He listened to Caleb's account without interrupting. He looked at the 5 signed witness statements. He looked at the fire damage map that Eleanor had sketched from memory and measurement that morning. He didn't editorialize. He didn't minimize. He asked 3 specific questions and wrote down the answers. Then he said, "I've had 2 other complaints about Clay this year. Didn't have enough to move on either of them. This," he tapped the stack of statements, "is different." "Will you file it?" Caleb said. "Already filing it," Moss said. "I'm also wiring the federal marshal's office in Abilene. An arson on a property with an active federal land investigation isn't local business, Morgan. They'll want to know." Caleb looked at Eleanor. She gave him nothing on her face because she'd learned he took information better without commentary. But she felt it, the shift, the particular weight of a situation moving from their hands into the hands of something larger and more permanent. "How long?" Caleb said. "Marshal's office responds in days, not weeks," Moss said. "And I'll ride out to look at your south fence line today." He paused. "One more thing. I've had word that Weston Clay's been having conversations in town. About Miss Hayes." Caleb went very still. Moss looked at Eleanor directly. "He's been suggesting your credentials aren't what you've claimed, that your treatment of the Morgan horses may have extended the illness rather than helped it. He's been saying it quietly to specific people." He paused. "I want you to know I don't give it any credence. 3 other ranchers in this county have told me directly that you help their animals, but you should know he's saying it." Eleanor held the sheriff's gaze. "Thank you for telling me. I'm telling you so you're not surprised," Moss said. "A man who sets fires at midnight and then files injunctions in local court is a man who's losing and knows it. The things he's saying about you are the words of someone with nothing left but noise." "I know," Eleanor said, "but noise can do damage." "It can," Moss agreed. "Which is why I'm also telling you that Harriet Beale has been considerably louder than Clay in the past week. And Harriet Beale has been in this county for 30 years. Eleanor looked at Caleb. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything, because what there was to say about Harriet Beale didn't need words. The federal investigator arrived 11 days later. His name was Aldous Keene, and he was a compact, gray-haired man from the Land Commission's field office who had the look of someone who had done this exact job in a dozen counties and had stopped being surprised by anything. He arrived with 2 assistants, a surveying kit, and a leather satchel full of documents, and he spent his first 2 hours on Morgan Ridge, walking the creek with Eleanor, and saying nothing while she explained what she'd found, and when, and how. He asked good questions. Precise, specific, the kind that told you the person asking them already understood the framework and was looking for specific pieces to fit into it. On the second day, he walked Clay's fence line with Caleb and Hank and Robert Beale. He found the place where the pipe had been removed, the disturbed bank, the backfill that didn't match the surrounding soil, the scar in the ground where iron fittings had been dug out in a hurry. He photographed it. He measured it. He wrote it down. On the third day, he sat at the Morgan Ridge kitchen table and interviewed Eleanor, then Caleb, then Harriet Beale, then Robert Beale, then Hank, then Ruiz, then Eddie. He was with each of them for as long as it took. He didn't rush any of them. On the morning of the 4th day, he packed his surveying kit and his leather satchel, and came to find Caleb and Eleanor in the barn. "I'm not going to tell you my conclusions," he said. "That's not how this works. The report goes to the commissioner and then runs its course." He paused. "But I will tell you that what I found on this property and adjacent to it is consistent with the complaints filed, and that the evidence of removal and tampering is notable." "Notable," Caleb said. "I've written stronger words in my report," Keene said. "I wanted you to understand that." He looked at Eleanor. "The mineral analysis you conducted with your mother's testing method, I confirmed it with my own equipment. Your readings were accurate." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. Simply. Something in Keene's expression shifted, not quite a smile. Not quite approval. The expression of a man who had expected to assess a woman's amateur work and found something that didn't require adjusting. "Yes," he said, "I can see that you do." He tipped his hat to her and shook Caleb's hand and rode out. But Weston Clay was formally charged 5 weeks later. The marshal's office in Abilene handled it. That included deliberate contamination of a shared water source, destruction of property by fire, filing a fraudulent injunction, and 1 count of attempting to corrupt a public official, the deputy commissioner who had already resigned and would be facing his own proceedings. Clay's lawyer filed a response, and Clay himself said nothing publicly, but the word moved through Cedar Bluff in the way words always moved through small towns, fast, complete, and impossible to put back. Caleb told Eleanor about the charges on the afternoon the marshal's letter arrived. He read it at the kitchen table, and then set it down and looked at it for a long moment. "It's over," he said. "The legal part," she said. "Yes." "What's left?" She looked at him. "The ranch," she said. "The east fence still needs 2 posts. The barn roof has a section Hank says isn't sitting right. Drummer needs another month before he's back to full work." She paused. "And the herb garden I started on the south side of the house is going to need tending, or it won't survive to fall." He looked at her for a long moment. "You started an herb garden?" 10 days ago. You didn't notice because you were focused on the fence line." "I was. That's fine. That's why there are 2 of us." He was quiet. He looked at the letter, then at her, then at the window, then back at her. "I want to show you something," he said. He took her to the east side of the main house, the side that got the morning light sheltered from the afternoon heat by the overhang. She had walked past it dozens of times without registering it as more than exterior wall. He stopped at a door she hadn't opened. It was a small addition to the main structure built onto the side of the house with its own exterior access and a single window that faced east. He opened the door and stepped back. She looked inside. It was a room she hadn't seen before. He had worked on it clearly recently. The shelves along the west wall were new wood, still bright cut and fitted with the precise care of a man who worked with his hands, the way he did everything completely without shortcuts. The window had been cleaned and reglazed. The floor had been swept and laid with a piece of flat limestone along the threshold. Along the shelves in careful intervals, he had placed her glass jars, the ones she'd brought in her satchel, and the ones she'd accumulated since arriving arranged by size, with space between them as though they'd always lived there. At the center of the room below the east window, he had built a work table, solid wide with a lip along the front edge to keep things from rolling. The exact right height for someone to stand and work without bending. The exact height she realized for her. She stood in the doorway and didn't say anything for a moment. Caleb said from behind her, "I built it while you were managing the Keene interviews. Hank helped with the shelving because I didn't want to wait on my shoulder to be right." A pause. "It's not finished. I want to put in a second shelf below the window if you think you need it. And there should be a hook for your satchel. I know where you always put it down, and it's never where it should be." She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the way he stood when he was uncertain, not physically uncertain, not shuffling or avoidant, but internally uncertain, the look of a man who has done a thing from the deepest honest part of himself and is now waiting to find out if it landed right. She said, "You built this for me." "Yes." While all of that was happening, the investigator, the marshal, the fire, "It helped me think," he said. "Building something when everything else was—" He paused. "It helped me stay forward." She looked back at the room, at the shelves, at the jars lined up in the morning light coming through the clean east window, at the work table with its careful lip along the front edge built to exactly her height. She thought about a letter that had arrived in Harlan County folded twice soft at the edges from being handled. She thought about the word honest sitting in the center of it like a stone. She thought about stepping off a train into a dying world and finding a man with a lathered horse and a face that was holding too much and deciding not consciously, not with words, but in the way you decide things that matter, that whatever this was, she was not walking away from it. She turned back to him. "The second shelf," she said. Yes, below the window, and the hook left side of the door not right. I'm left-handed about the satchel. He nodded, filed it. She could see him filing it. Caleb, she said. Yes. I need you to understand something. He met her eyes. Full attention. The particular way he listened when something mattered. I did not come here to save your ranch, she said. I came here because you wrote an honest letter and I answered it. Everything after that, the horses, the water, Clay, the letters, the investigator, that wasn't me saving something of yours. That was me doing what you do when something is yours. She held his gaze. This ranch is mine too. That's why I fought for it. Something moved through his face that she'd never seen before, in the full. All the fragments of it she'd caught over these weeks assembled at once into a complete expression. Not relief, not gratitude. Recognition. The deep specific recognition of a man who has been seen exactly as he is, and found the experience not frightening, but the opposite. He reached out and took her hand, the left one, the one that had healed from the rope burn and still had the faint mark of it across the base of her fingers. He held it the way he'd held it in the tack room during the storm, carefully and with intention, and this time he didn't let go. I know, he said. I've known it for a while. I wasn't sure you had. I'm slow, he said. Not blind. She laughed. It surprised her, a real laugh, the first real unguarded one she could remember in weeks, because the last weeks had not offered much space for it. It surprised him too. She could see that the way his face opened at the sound of it, as though it was something he was hearing for the first time, and already knew he'd want to hear again. No, she said. You're not blind. He kept hold of her hand. They stood in the doorway of the room he'd built for her, while everything else was falling apart. And outside, the Texas hill country was doing what it always did in the last weeks of summer, beginning slowly to exhale. The heat was still present, but different. The brutal intention of July, easing towards something that could be lived in. The creek was coming back up. Not all the way, not yet, but moving in the right direction. The grass in the lower field had recovered enough to hold color. Drummer was in the paddock every morning now, carrying his own weight fully with the dignified self-possession of a horse that had been through something, and intended everyone to know it hadn't beaten him. Hank had finished the last of the east fence the previous Friday, and had said with the particular brevity that was his version of sentiment that it was better work than the original. Eddie had started asking Eleanor questions about plant medicine, with the careful, hungry attention of a young man who had found a subject that interested him and didn't know yet where it would take him. Ruiz had planted 3 things in the kitchen garden without being asked, and had not explained himself and didn't need to. Cedar Bluff was not the same town it had been when Eleanor arrived, or perhaps it was the same town, and she was seeing it differently. Now seeing it as a place that belonged to her, the way it belonged to the people who'd been born into it, not through length of time, but through what she'd put into it and what it had put back. Mrs. Aldine Marsh had stopped her on the street 2 weeks after the investigator left and said in the stiff, controlled tone of a woman who was doing something that cost her, "What you did for this county. The water, the complaint, what you asked Robert Beale to do. I understand it better now than I did before." A pause. "You're a capable woman, Miss Hayes." Eleanor had said simply, "I'm a Morgan Ridge woman, Mrs. Marsh. That's what capable looks like out here." Mrs. Marsh had looked at her for a moment with that expression, loss old and specific, and then nodded once and walked on. It was not a friendship. It was not required to be. Now Caleb said, still holding her hand in the doorway of the room he'd built, "I want to talk to you about something." "All right," she said. "I'd like us to be married properly," he said. "Not the arrangement we came into, not the letter and the agreement. Properly, if you're willing." She looked at him. "We aren't married properly. We went before the Justice of the Peace in Cedar Bluff the day after you arrived," he said. That was... He paused. That was a practical arrangement between 2 people who didn't know each other. And now... He held her gaze. His jaw worked for a moment. "Now I know you," he said. "And I'd like to make the same decision knowing what I know." She was quiet for a moment. Outside somewhere in the paddock, she heard Drummer move the familiar sound of his particular walk, unhurried and slightly self-important. She heard Eddie talking to one of the other horses, the way he'd started doing, since he'd been asking her questions about animal communication. She heard the creek. She heard the wind moving through the cedar at the hill's edge the way it always did in the late afternoon, like something breathing out. Heard Morgan Ridge. Alive, all of it. Living. Yes, she said. One word. No preamble. The same directness she'd brought to everything here. Every decision, every moment where something was true and needed to be said plainly. His hand tightened around hers. Not dramatically. Not with performance. Just the pressure of a man's hand on the hand of a woman who had answered his first letter and then answered everything after it, and who intended to keep answering for as long as there were questions worth asking. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me, Caleb. This is where I live." He looked at the room. He looked at her. He looked at the land through the east window, the hill country spreading out in the long, late summer light. The creek running, the horses moving the fences, standing everything alive. Everything theirs. And Morgan Ridge, which had been dying on the day Eleanor Hayes stepped off a train into it, which had been stripped down to its last reserves by drought and sickness, and a man who had wanted to take it, which had stood at the edge of losing everything, and had held Morgan Ridge, was no longer surviving. It was living. And that was the difference, and that was enough, and that was everything.